last time we were talking about the enclosure movement, and that was the effort of aristocratic landholders to legally enclose lands, to turn them into their own private possessions, to remove them from the use of communes and villages, to be collectively farmed, and to kind of enclose them, use the courts to legally privatize these lands, and then to turn them into profit-making centers, primarily in the production of wool that would be then produced into fabric and threads that could be then sold on the market in a capitalist market, in an internal trade and in a European trade in woolens. Now, the enclosure movement also, as we said before, like every aspect of sort of emerging capitalism, has its winners and losers. And some of the losers of that enclosure movement, that move to turn private land into a profit-making center, to a capitalist profit-making center, some of the losers in this transition were, of course, the peasants who were thrown off the land, and many of them ended up becoming part of a growing cottage industry within Britain. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these displaced peasants ended up sort of setting up little miniature factories in their homes and cottages. That's why it was called cottage industry, where they took that wool and they wove it into yarn, as you see the women in the back doing, and then weaving that yarn into cloth, woolen cloth, that could be then sold in the marketplace. And you can see the man on the right working a loom. Many of these cottage workers, these cottage industry workers, worked for merchants who would rent them the machines, who would provide them with the wool, who would then buy the finished fabrics that they made off of them. It's important to note here is that these peasants that were once working in the fields, largely living in a world that was disconnected from any kind of larger marketplace. They had no real they did not belong to a commercial economy. Most of what they did all day was farm to produce food for their own use, for their own households. And of course, if we go back to medieval times, they might give some of what they had produced to the lord of the manor, and then he would provide them protection and that sort of thing. What we see now with this emergence of these workers in these cottage industries that are scattered across Britain and northwestern Europe is that they become part of the commercial economy. They are now working for wages or usually piecework. They were paid by the piece or how much they produced. They were then using that to buy things on the market because they weren't raising food for themselves. And so they were kind of enveloped in this larger capitalist commercial economy. And this is one of the ways in which we see capitalism emerging in northwestern Europe and in Britain in the 1500s and 1600s. In addition to that, there's another aspect to the emerging capitalist order, and that, of course, is the emergence of plantation economy in the New World, in the Americas. Prior to the conquest of the Americas by Spain and then later by Britain, prior to that, most international trade was largely conducted for luxury goods for the very wealthy. But what we see in the development of the plantation economy in the Americas, utilizing the vast lands that are taken away from Native Americans, and of course the use ultimately of African slave labor to produce these commercial crops, is the development of a mass commercial economy in these plantation crops. And these, of course, are not just what we see emerging here is not just products that are going to be a few products that are going to be traded for the elite, but these are mass products. And this is another aspect of the emerging capitalist order, that all of these things, you see here, tobacco, sugar, coffee, cocoa, is another plantation crop that arose in the Americas, was destined for a mass commercial consuming public, which again enhances the reach and power of this new capitalist order that is emerging in Europe. It's kind of also interesting to note, I can't remember if we talked about this before, but if you look at these three crops, and if you add, of course, in to cocoa as well, what you notice about all of them, of course, is that they are all addictive, or at least in the case of sugar, something that once you get a taste for, you don't want to give up. And it's kind of interesting that the first great capitalist agricultural crops were ones that had their own built-in demand, which of course is half the capitalist equation, right? And these plantations supplied this demand, but the demand was literally built into the biology of these plants. They were addictive, and once people got a taste for them, they had to have more. So it's interesting that, as I said, the first sort of great capitalist crops had demand built into them. And what emerged in this new capitalist commercial system that engaged much of the transatlantic world at this period was, the trade in large bulk materials, manufactured goods and luxuries being sent out from Europe to the New World, and materials being sold to Africa, where they would be traded for slaves that would be brought to the New World, and who would be used to raise these commercial crops that would then go back to Europe and to England to continue to bolster this new capitalist commercial economy. And alongside this legitimate trade, to the extent that it was legitimate, I mean, trade in slaves to our own minds today seems very illegitimate, but it was legal at the time. Alongside this was, of course, the an illegitimate economy that kind of grew off the legitimate trade. And there was a lot of, just like today, when you have a legal commercial economy, you also have an illegal and an illicit one. And this came in the form of piracy, which preyed on this international trade. And as fun as it is to sort of talk about pirates, we're going to have to move on from that. But just to know that with the emergence of a sort of transatlantic trading system in legitimate products, you also had the rise of a massive sort of organized crime economy that preyed upon it for a while. Of course, ultimately, this was not permissible to the powers that be, and gradually the major states of Europe, particularly France and England, were able to use their navies to ultimately put most of these pirates out of business. The other thing to note about this period in European history is that there was kind of a constant warfare. As you can see from this chart that we're talking about the 1600s and the 1700s, you'll note that the black areas, which are when war is occurring, were nearly constant through the 1600s and 1700s. And these wars were, as I said, nearly constant, and some of them were largely they were about religion, Protestant versus Catholic, the Spanish using their wealth, the Catholic kings of Spain using the wealth that they had amassed in the New World to try to put down the burgeoning Protestant resistance in Northern Europe. And of course, at the very end of this period, in the 1700s and 1800s, we'll see a lot of wars triggered by the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But the wars being constantly fought for a century from the late 1600s to the late 1700s were about other things. They weren't. The religious wars pretty much consumed the middle parts of the 17th century, but the wars of the late 17th century and much of the 18th century prior to the French Revolution, these were wars that were about other things. They were not necessarily about religion. These were wars in which the various kings and royal houses of Europe were trying to extend their power against other royal houses in Europe, and the burgeoning capitalist economy provided them with the revenues to raise larger and larger armies and navies to conduct these wars against each other for primacy over trade. And these dynastic wars were really about controlling trade. We talked about mercantilism before, and the idea was widely held in Europe in the late 1600s and through much of the 1700s, was the idea that you wanted to contain as much trade within your own imperial system. So this motivated kings and leaders of various nations to try to expand their imperial holdings, to try to counter the moves of other kings, and this prompted a whole series of wars. And a lot of these wars were about dynastic succession. So various royal houses were trying to gain control of other royal houses. Sometimes this was through marriage, sometimes this was through war, and oftentimes it was about wars when the dynastic inheritance was in dispute. For example, if a king did not have an obvious heir apparent, there would be a struggle to control that royal house that various royal houses within Europe would engage in. There was, for example, the War of Spanish Succession in 1701 to 1714. There was Queen Anne's War of roughly the same period. There was the War of the Austrian Succession of the 1740s, King George's War of that same period, and biggest of them all, the 7 Years' War of the 1750s and 60s. And these were partly about nation states jockeying for position in Europe, but they were increasingly about controlling trade, controlling bigger and bigger parts of the globe. And indeed, the 7 Years' War fought in Europe, the Atlantic, India, and North America, where it is known as the French and Indian War, is really the first world war in a way. And these wars were the outgrowth of economic competition based on an early form of capitalism, as we talked about, called mercantile capitalism. But before we get to figuring out mercantile capitalism, let's figure out what capitalism is about in and of itself. The role of money in world history is a huge subject. Just for the period we are talking about, that is the late 1600s and 1700s, you can fill a library of books written on the subject, books about the role of money in the creation of nation states, the rise of that huge cottage industry we talked about, and the role of money in that massive human rights crime known as slavery. There are books on the utter transformation of the Americas that are driven in part by the quest for money and riches, the new emerging capitalist order. And it all comes down to exactly that, to capitalism. Its drive, what is propelling it, what is impelling it during all this time, and down to the present day. And so what is this thing called capitalism? It's complicated. It involves investment and savings and consumption and labor and supply and demand. But really, we can understand capitalism if we focus on one single, very simple, one-syllable word. And that word is growth. Now, we talked about how the scientific revolution a couple of weeks ago can also be defined by a simple, everyday, albeit multi-syllable word, two-syllable word called progress. The idea that the application of theory, experimentation, observation can lead to new discoveries. The belief in this, that we can understand more, improve things, both in the more theoretical realm, such as the nature of the universe, but also in practical terms, like curing diseases or making things more productive. Which leads back to this other word, growth. Indeed, the concept of growth is to the economy what the concept of progress is to science. In other words, a new way of thinking about the world that, when we're talking about the scientific revolution, the idea that we can improve things by using our rational minds to kind of understand the nature of the universe and then developing applications from that theoretical understanding to give us greater command over the world and therefore to lead to progress in understanding the world, progress in manipulating nature, progress in doing all kinds of things. Well, growth is kind of the equivalent idea for capitalism. Indeed, the concept of growth is to the economy what the concept of progress is to science, a new way of thinking that leads to unprecedented change. Growth is what it's all about. Always. Watch the news, look at government reports, listen to economists and business people. What are they always talking about? Is the economy growing or is it not? And everything comes out of that. That is the most important factor. It determines everything. Your very life and standard of living depends upon this concept of growth, this idea that we can constantly produce more. And just as we accept this idea, as we accept the idea that science will lead to progress, it's part of our modern world, right? The idea that, yes, science will give us greater command over nature and will allow us to manipulate nature to our own benefit in better ways. That's the idea of progress. Similarly, growth, we accept the idea of growth as natural. In other words, most of us just accept the idea that there's going to be scientific progress. But again, as we talked about during the scientific revolution discussion last week, the idea that, this idea of progress is really something new. Through most of human history, the idea that we could, gain greater control over nature, gain greater understanding of nature, and therefore improve our lives was just an alien idea. And similarly, through most of human history, until the scientific revolution, people did not think of progress as the natural way of things. And similarly, they didn't think growth was the natural way of things. And again, to continue the analogy, was there progress prior to the scientific revolution? Of course there was, but it was hit and miss. The entire mindset of the world was not based on it. Similarly, was there growth before the rise of capitalism from the 1500s on? Of course there was, but it came about in two ways that are different from our own era. One was the settlement of new lands. For example, when the first people arrived in the Americas 20,000 years ago, or even earlier, the native peoples, they increased economic production because there were lands to hunt on, to till, to farm, and so forth. Another source of growth, of course, was demographic growth. More people means more economic activity. That's pretty straightforward. So you either bring more land under cultivation, you can grow that way, or you just have more babies and you have more people that survive and they're going to have more economic activity. But basically all that means is that for the individual person, life stays roughly the same. Yes, there's more economic activity because there's more people. There's more economic activity because there's more people on new lands. But the average person doesn't experience the idea of growth personally. That they don't expect that the economy is going to benefit them and that they're going to get better and better off, and that the economy is going to keep growing and provide more and a higher standard of living for people. That is a product of the modern world, of what capitalism has brought us. And it is magnificently, delivered in terms of the growth that capitalism has brought to the world in terms of economic activity. If we take a look at this chart, you can sort of see, if we go back to the year 1, basically, back in Roman times, the population of the world was about 180 million. And economic historians have calculated that, utilizing today's dollars, the economic output of the world was about $80 billion, which gave a world economy per capita income. In other words, roughly what people would make. Now, of course, we understand that in earlier periods there wasn't much of a commercial economy, but basically the value of what they made would be equal to about $440 in today's world. So a standard at the very bottom of the poorest nations of today. The 440 per capita annual income is things that countries at the very bottom of the economic ladder globally experience. By 1500, on the eve of capitalist expansion, the world population had grown to 450 million, a little less than 3 times what had gone before, over 1,500 years, and the world economy stood at roughly 250 billion. But the key figure is the one on the right over here, because what you see here, of course, from 440 to 550 is, yes, there is some growth in per capita income, that people are somewhat better off on average if you're averaging out all of humanity, but the gain is not particularly impressive. It looks like about a 25% growth rate over 1,500 years. That is really basically standing still. Now let's look so that's the 1500 is the eve of capitalist expansion. Let's look at it today, roughly 500 years later, as capitalism has been fully realized. Here, of course, we see the population of the world has gone up to 7.7 billion, so a massive expansion of roughly 15, 16 times. But the world economy has been on steroids. I mean, you can see the economy, the world economic output in 2000. These figures, by the way, are for 2008-19. Is $80 trillion. And if you look at this key figure on the right, you see that what capitalism has delivered is a massive increase in the per capita wealth of people of the world to 10,400. That's a 20-time increase, 25-time increase over the per capita income on the eve of capitalist expansion. Now, part of that has to do, of course, with the science. That as science has progressed, it has given us greater command over nature, greater tools to exploit the environment. For example, the development of artificial fertilizers that have massively increased agricultural output, to just name one particular factor that science has contributed to the overall economic growth of the world. But a big part of this has to do with capitalism itself. Now, capitalist economics are really quite complicated and beyond the scope of what we can talk about in this lecture or even in this course generally. But and sometimes beyond my ability to really understand. This is for economists, of course, to really fully explicate. And if we're going to understand the concept of growth, we have to understand sort of another basic concept about capitalism. And what it's really based on is the idea of 2 things: credit and the future. So let's talk about money, credit, and all that sort of thing right now. Before the modern capitalist era, the purpose of money was basically to act as a medium of exchange, and money was basically used to solve a couple of basic problems about trade. In other words, 2 people trying to find a way to As civilization arose, of course, people became more specialized. So you had farmers, you had craftsmen, you had other people, and each would have something that they wanted to trade with another. Now money arose a long time ago. Even prior to the Roman era, going back to about 600 or 700 BC, and money rose to solve two basic problems about trade. If we think about it, one is the obvious one, right? That if I produce shoes and you produce apples, and I want to trade with you. It's very important that you want shoes and I want apples. In other words, everybody who was trying to trade things would have to find somebody who wanted what they had. Money solved that problem. It was a medium of exchange. Everybody wanted money because they could then use it to buy whatever they needed, and so everything could be utilized. So the development of money helped solve that problem of matching a buyer and a seller much more easily. And the other thing, of course, that money did, was a little less obvious, is that if people are bartering directly to one another, it is very difficult to establish value. What exactly are the apples worth compared to shoes? I mean, how many bushels of apples is equal to a pair of shoes? Again, money solves that problem so that so people don't have to figure out a million different calculations of what shoes are worth, what apples are worth, what wheat is worth, what a service like having a lawyer do a legal contract is worth. We don't have to solve that problem because everything has its own monetary value, and that kind of eases or greases the wheels of trade, because we can all we come up with a value for something. It has a monetary value. We know what it is. We know what the monetary value of what we're selling is, and it eases trade. What capitalism does, though, is it gives another meaning to money, to that medium of exchange. What it does is, in previous eras, money was basically utilized to determine the value of things that actually existed, things that were, physical things that were there, or if not physical things that were there, if you wanted to have your hair cut, this was a service, but it was a kind of a physical service. You were actually getting something real for your money. Capitalism kind of reinvents money. In capitalism, by its very name, money is converted into capital. Capital, of course, is money that is invested into something in the hopes of future gain, right? You invest your capital into a factory, into this, into that, in the hopes that you will make more money out of that. That's what the difference between just sort of regular money, the money you use to go to the store and buy a Coke, or go to the Carl's Jr. to buy a hamburger, and the money that you invest into something in the hopes of future returns. And what this is really about, and so capital is the engine of growth, because people put their money in, they put it into new technology, they put it into new land, they put it into new factories, they put it into whatever in the hopes of getting a greater return, and this fuels growth. This fuels that this is the capital is the engine of growth. That's why we call our system capitalism. And what that money is also, what capital is also, of course, it's credit. You're offering money to somebody, and credit, of course, is based on the idea of trust. Trust in a couple of things. Trust in the person that you're giving this credit to, this money to invest for you. Now, sometimes you invest the money, of course, in your own activities, but more often, you're investing in others. Your banks and investors and stuff are giving money to others, and of course, you have to have a certain faith that they are going to be competent and smart, and be able to turn that capital into more capital that will reward you with profit or a return on your investment. And of course, you also have trust that the person's not a crook and is going to run off with your money and disappear. And of course, what capitalism creates is a whole set of, the government kind of steps in and sets up all of these sort of legal protections to protect property and capital in all kinds of ways. Contract law gets developed during these early years of capitalism, in others, to protect people so that somebody can't just run off with their money, that they have to do what they say they're going to do. You get corporate law, which, kind of forces corporations to act based on their charter, to do what they're supposed to do. So you have that whole legal environment to make sure that you have trust, that the trust you're placing in the person by giving them your money, that they cannot run off and abscond with it or whatever. So that's that there's that trust. But there's also another kind of trust, a much larger trust that is going on when you make an investment, when you use capital, when people invest it with others to in the hopes that they will get a return on that investment. And that is a trust in growth itself. There's a faith in the future that the economy will continue to grow, and that that investing this money will produce. It's in a sense a faith in the future, a faith in growth itself. Because without that faith in the future, without that faith that the money you put out will bring back more. And of course, there's always the understanding that, with investment comes risk, but the idea that in general, things are going to continue to grow and get bigger and more profitable and make you money and make the person you're giving, you're lending your money to, you're investing in, they'll make money. But it's this general idea, and again, it's new to the capitalist world of the 1500s that emerges in the 1500s. It's new, it's not something that existed in most of the history of the world. This faith in the future, this faith in growth, this faith that by putting money into something, it was going to produce a greater return, that using technology or using new inputs or using labor in a more efficient way, in a variety of ways, that you could actually produce real, genuine growth, not based on conquering new lands, not based on having more babies, but the idea that you can actually grow things. In that sense, it's kind of like progress in science. It's this new attitude that people have, this faith in the future, this faith in growth, that spurs capitalism on. Because if you don't have that faith in growth, if you don't have that faith that things can get wealthier and wealthier, then you're not going to invest, and the economy will not grow. And this faith in the future, this faith that the money you put out will bring you back a return on your investment, this faith in growth, this faith in expansion that is built into the capitalist model and is so much a part of our modern world, modern capitalist world, is based on the idea that the faith you have is a reasonable one, right? That you're investing with somebody who has a reasonable business plan, who has a reasonable, the thing he's investing in or she's investing in, that she's going to be building in. Say somebody's building a bakery in a town, and you're going to judge the success of that bakery. Are there other bakeries in that town? Is there a market for baked goods in that town? Whatever it is that you're investing in, the idea is, and a lot of economics works on this idea that your investment is made on a rational basis. You look at all the factors and you decide, yeah, I think there's a chance for real growth in this town. There is a chance for, there's a demand for baked goods, and we can fulfill that demand by investing in a bakery. And this person, this woman or man who's building this bakery knows what they're doing. And in other words, so the money that goes into this bakery will build something real, and it will build something lasting. It'll build something that turns a profit, and maybe will lead to another, another branch of the bakery in another part of the town, or a bakery in another town, and that this will continue to grow. And the idea is that it is, the hope is that it's all based on a rational assessment of various factors, that the growth that the person is promising, who's you're investing with, has a realistic business model. But as we of course know, that people are not always rational, and certainly not always capable of a reasonable and rational assessment of what is likely to be profitable or what is true value. It's one thing to say, okay, there's no bakery in this town, and I'm going to invest in it. It's another thing to say, we can build 10 bakeries because, I love, baked goods, and so it must be that everybody does. And that would, you're kind of letting your emotions run away with things and thinking, not looking at things rationally. So again, capitalism is basically a human-created institution. I mean, a lot of times economists kind of argue that it's a sort of this natural thing, supply and demand. Nature has that sort of force at work, but capitalism is a human institution because it's based on the human imagination and the ability of human beings to foresee future growth. That's what capitalism is all about. But humans as beings, as we all know, are not particularly rational at times. And this explains why capitalism itself sometimes goes off the rails. And in fact, if we look at the history of capitalism, that the whole history of capitalism is the history really of volatility. There are periods of great growth, and then there are periods of contraction. And a lot of what those periods of growth are about is periods of sort of irrational exuberance and belief that growth is assured or guaranteed, or that it's going to be at a really high level, and people stop thinking rationally and begin to get a little too emotional about things, and they don't see things through rationally, and that's when sort of capitalism can go off the rails. For example, in the 19th century, as railroads were beginning to sort of take off, people became kind of crazy about investing in railroads. It was a really popular investment. People had a lot of faith in the future. You know, these railroads offered a new way of shipping goods and people, and you couldn't get enough railroads, and people started investing like crazy, and as some railroads began to make a lot of money for their investors, what do other people? They look upon that and they say, wow, if that railroad made money, I'm going to invest in this railroad. And soon you have basically too many railroads being built, and of course then you get a crash in the economy, and that explains the volatility of the economy. A more recent example of that, of course, is what happened about 12 years ago in the financial crisis. Again, I don't want to go into that in too much detail right now, but if we remember, it was basically what a famous president of the Federal Reserve called or what actually the economist John Maynard Keynes called animal spirits, or what a Federal Reserve Board president years ago called irrational exuberance. And that is, if we remember it all, people came to the belief that housing prices were forever going to go up, and people were buying and selling homes, flipping them constantly, and banks were lending them money, all in this future faith, this faith that housing prices were always going to go up. People always needed houses, and it would never go down. And banks began lending crazily amounts of money on very little, collateral and other things. I remember, just with my own example, I bought a home, bought a condominium back in the early 2000s, and I went to the bank to get a mortgage, right, to get a loan. In other words, the bank having basically giving me a lot of money, right, because it's Los Angeles and housing prices are high. They're going to lend me a lot of money in the faith, both in me, that I'm a trustworthy credit risk, and also in the faith that the house that I'm buying, that I would be able to pay off this mortgage, and that even if I couldn't, let's say something bad happened to me, or their assessment of my credit worthiness turned out to be wrong, and I turned out to be a total flake, and couldn't pay back my mortgage. They had faith in the market itself. They had faith in the market itself that the housing price would go up, and that if in case I went, they had to foreclose on my mortgage if I couldn't pay it back, that they would then get possession of the house and they could sell it and make their money back. But what began to happen in the early 2000s when I was buying my house was kind of an irrational exuberance. There was such a conviction that housing prices were going to go nothing but up, 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 that banks began to lose their sobriety about what's a reasonable credit risk. And I remember when I went for my mortgage, I took the sort of the old attitude that I'd learned from my parents. You need to put 20% down. You need to have all your ducks in a row in terms of your paperwork and your finance and all my tax returns. And I remember going to this, and this was during the rise of the bubble. It was at the beginning of the bubble, fortunately not at the end. Otherwise, I would have been slammed with a much higher cost of a home. But what happened was, I was just astonished that the lenders, they're going to give me hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're going to lend me hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I said to them, do you need my bank statements? Do you need to have my pay stubs? Do you need to have my income tax returns? What do you need to show that I'm a good credit risk? And basically their attitude was, nah, you don't need any of that stuff. Just declare what you owe, how much you're worth, and declare how much you make, and we're fine with that. They didn't seem to want to proof that I'm trustworthy, and the reason for that was because they felt, even if he fails, we're going to get this home, the price is going to rise, we'll be able to sell it and make money. Of course, we know what happened. They lent out too much money, the housing market collapsed, which leads me to my second home purchase. So about 8 or 9 years ago, at the bottom of the market, I sold my wife and I sold our condominium, and we were looking to buy a home. We wanted a bigger home for our growing family, and so we went to the bank. And now, of course, this was after the bubble had popped. And the banks had realized that they had been completely unreasonable in the expectation that housing prices were going to continue to go up, because, of course, housing prices had crashed, and their faith in the future had disappeared. And this time when I went to them, they weren't nearly as casual about paperwork being presented. I had to present so much paperwork. It got kind of crazy. I kept expecting them to take blood samples of me to make sure that I didn't have any illnesses that might prevent me from getting the mortgage. It was so much tighter, and that's kind of an indication of sort of the boom and bust and that faith in the future that capitalism is all about. That faith in future growth that had completely disappeared because of the crash in housing prices. And when that happens, of course, the ability to borrow money to invest becomes much more expensive, right? You have to pay a much higher interest rate on this stuff, and of course that undermining of the faith in future growth can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because as money dries up for investment, it makes it more difficult to grow the economy, and it kind of fulfills itself, and that's when you get a recession. That's when you get a depression, and that's what, of course, what we had in 2008, 2009, and why it was such a slow recovery, that really we did not really recover until about 2013, 2014 from the recession that was caused by the housing crash, because it takes a long time for people to allow their confidence to get back. Once burned, you're not going to touch the stove again, and so it took quite a while to get out of it, as it did during the Great Depression of the 1930s, something we'll be talking about later in the course. But to kind of illustrate just how crazy things would get, I want to talk about something else. So if we're talking about railroads before, a little bit earlier, right? The great investment of the 19th century, and railroads are real. I mean, they have real value. They ship goods, they ship people, and there's real value. Now, sometimes they get overvalued, right? People building too many railroads, people investing too much money in railroads, and of course, housing is real too, right? People have to live somewhere, and housing, particularly in desirable areas, is a real thing. People really want houses. But what's fascinating is sometimes the irrationality, the investment stuff, is on something completely speculative, some completely ridiculous. And I think it's kind of interesting that the first great capitalist bubble in world history occurred over something that is kind of strange to imagine that it happened, and that is tulips. In the early 1600s, as capitalism is emerging, the country of Holland, the Netherlands, kind of went crazy for tulips. And what's interesting about what happened with what they call tulip mania, what's interesting that happened with tulip mania was that and it's not coincidental, that it happened to occur in Holland, because Holland was, if there was one country in Europe that was kind of at the cutting edge of capitalist innovation and capitalist development, it was Holland. Holland was, of all the places in Europe, Holland was in some ways the first to kind of figure out how capitalism worked. And the Dutch, beginning in the late 1500s and early 1600s, after they had thrown off the yoke of the Spanish, who ruled them prior to that, the Dutch, really began to invest heavily in trade. They put a lot of their capital into trade. They invested heavily in ships. Many of them were armed, which they used to, blow their competitors out of the water, the Portuguese and the Arabs, particularly in the Indian Ocean, and the Dutch took over the East Indies spice trade. The Dutch were also kind of the first to figure out modern banking. I mean, they kind of learned some of these ideas from the northern Italians, but they sort of perfected them more. And so by the 1630s, the Dutch had become they were the most market-oriented capitalist society in Europe, and they were also the wealthiest by far. It was called the Dutch Golden Age, the early 1600s, late 1500s and early 1600s. And what had emerged in Holland wasn't just, there were a lot of wealthy people, of course, great fortunes were made, but the wealth was rather widely spread. There was Holland was sort of the first country in Europe, and perhaps the first country in the world, to develop a major middle class of people. In other words, a large body of people that were not like super wealthy, but they were not living on the edge. They were not impoverished. They owned a certain amount of, they might own their own homes, they might have businesses, and they were also open. They also had a certain amount of discretionary income to purchase consumer goods, and also to speculate, and also to invest. There was a wide population in Holland in the early 1600s that had this money at this discretionary income that they didn't need to survive, and it wasn't just a few wealthy people, it was widely spread. So it's not it's not coincidental, as I said, that this first capitalist economy, this first sort of economy that produced a major middle class, a product of capitalism, was also the first to experience a capitalist speculative bubble, and it happened to be about tulips. So let's talk about tulips. Now, tulips are actually native to Turkey, and the Dutch kind of, but with sort of increased trade, increased shipping, these tulips had been introduced to Europe, and the Dutch sort of discovered, tulips this way, and they fell in love with tulips. They just absolutely went crazy for tulips. Partly, they grow very well in Holland. It has the right climate, the right soil for tulips, and the Dutch went absolutely crazy for tulips. They love them, and in some ways, what's not to love, right? They're very pretty, but they also had two other key qualities about them that made him, in a strange sort of way, the perfect investment. So one thing about tulips is that they come in many, many varieties, and some of these varieties are rarer than others. Some are perhaps, of course, this is all in the eyes of the viewer, but some are more beautiful than others, whatever that means. But the point is that there were a lot of variations, a lot of gradations in the value of tulips. Again, some are very rare, some are really exotic looking. They would have higher value than the more common and less exotic looking varieties. So you had a whole bunch of different kinds of tulips to invest in. Now, the other aspect of tulips that makes them kind of the perfect investment is that they are, and this is kind of crucial to the thing, they're not as ephemeral as they sound. And what I mean by that is, you're sort of saying, how can you invest in flowers? I mean, they bloom and then they die, and there's your investment. You invested all this money in a tulip, and now it's dead. But the thing about tulips is of course, anybody who's ever been in a florist shop or knows anything about gardening knows that tulips grow from bulbs, and bulbs last a very, very long time. If stored in a dark, cool, and dry place, they can last for decades. So in a sense, they have kind of exactly the kind of thing you would want to have in something you're investing in. It can last a long time. In that sense, it's kind of, in some ways, tulips are kind of like gold if you think about it. Gold, one of the things that makes gold so valuable is not just its beauty, and tulips of course have beauty, but it's all, and it's what's also sort of what tulips and gold share is that if gold, in terms of its chemistry, does not rust, it does not decay. So if you have gold, you don't have to worry that its value will be declining the longer you own it. In other words, it won't go bad. And the same thing kind of applied to tulips, that the bulbs, again, if taken care of properly, stored properly, and of course businesses emerged in Holland to store your bulbs for you, you could know that what you were investing in was not going to decay or go bad or rot or whatever. And so what developed in Holland in this period was a huge market in tulips, in the bulbs, of course. The prices that for rare ones went up astronomically. And I show this chart right here that shows what happened in 1636 and 1637. You can see this rise in prices of tulips over a period of just weeks and maybe a few months. Prices kept going up and up and up, encouraging more and more. So as people saw some people investing in tulips and making a ton of money, that those animal spirits that John Maynard Keynes talked about, that greed that motivates people, that motivates them to stop even thinking rationally anymore, sort of took over, just like with housing in our own time. And prices kept going up, encouraging more and more people. As people saw some people making money, everybody said, I want to make money too. And so, of course, everybody starts to invest in tulips, and the money goes up and up and up. And, of course, it's helped by the fact there's a lot of disposable income in Holland at that time. And banks began to sort of look at this and sort of say, wow, these prices are going up. And they too caught this sort of tulip bug and began offering credit to people to buy tulips. So you could actually borrow money from the banks to invest in tulips, because everybody had this shared belief that tulip prices were going to go nothing but higher and higher. And even if you couldn't pay back the loan you got from the bank could then, of course, could repossess your tulip bulbs, and they could sell them and make money. So, so restrictions on credit began to disappear, and this just kept feeding and feeding and feeding this tulip mania that engulfed Holland in 1636 and 1637. And at one time, you could actually sell a bulb. If it was a particularly rare and valuable bulb, you could sell it for enough to buy a home in Amsterdam. And then, of course, what happens to every bubble, as we've learned through the history of capitalism, is that when the price gets too high, when the price just keeps rising to a point where it's no longer sustainable, people begin to hesitate. They lose that faith in the future that is the engine of capitalism. They lose that faith in the future that tulip prices are going to forever go up, and people begin to try to say, I'm going to get out of this market. Usually something happens. There's usually a crisis event that happens. And people get nervous. They get worried. They lose that faith in the future. And when that fear sets in, people start to sell. And of course, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in capitalism that as people lose faith in the system, they begin to sell off they begin to sell their bulbs. And of course, as more people flood the market with bulbs, obviously supply and demand, the basic rule of capitalism, is that the price declines. This creates more panic, more fear, more dumping on the market. And of course, that's exactly what happened in Holland. And then, of course, adding to that was the fact that many people had to pay back their loans to banks. And when they couldn't pay back those loans to banks because the money that they were hoping to get out of the tulips to pay back those loans had disappeared, the banks started getting hit, and you started getting the bankruptcy of banks. They started to collapse. And the banks, of course, realizing this, stop offering credit to people to buy tulips, so that further depresses the tulip market, and you get basically a collapse of the Dutch economy based on this tulip mania. And this episode in tulip mania actually had long-term consequences for the history of the world in a way, all because of the tulips, and that is this. In the wake of the tulip collapse, now eventually the Dutch economy did begin to recover. It got over it because, it was still a sound economy. You still had the ships that the Dutch controlled. They still, had plantations in the East Indies where they were raising spices that Europeans wanted. And, the Dutch economy didn't, completely collapse and Holland turn into a basket case. But what did happen was, moving forward, the banks of Holland became much more reticent, much more hesitant to extend credit, not just for tulip buying. That was done. Nobody was going to be investing in that anymore. But just in even more reasonable investments, even in investments in trade, in actual goods and actual things that people really wanted beyond, that had real value, like spices or like other things. And what happened was, as these sort of banks became more hesitant, the Dutch economy suffered. It was no longer as expansive as it once was. That banks became more hesitant to extend credit, and Holland's economic supremacy began to sort of decline. Now, Holland remained a relatively wealthy country, but it lost its expansiveness. It lost its aggressiveness. It lost its desire for more and more growth. And what happened was, in other words, it got burned, and that capitalist belief in growth was undermined. And what this did was it kind of undermined Holland's role in global trade, just at the moment when England is starting to emerge as a major capitalist player, as we talked about in earlier lectures. And in a sense, this tulip mania sort of dethroned Holland as the premier economic powerhouse of Europe and allowed that to be transferred to England, which of course used its economic power to as a means to expand its empire and to grow into, of course, as we learn later, the greatest empire in the history of the world. And of course that led to England sort of settling in what is now the Americas. It's not surprising that the one major Dutch colony in North America, New Amsterdam, now New York, would ultimately be taken by the English. And I kind of like to think maybe the fact that Americans today speak English as opposed to Dutch is in part because of tulips. that the crash in the tulip market undermined people in Holland's faith in the future, faith in lending money. It caused the Dutch economy to stop growing, to stop being so expansive, and it allowed a new rival to emerge and to take its place, and that was England. So that is our discussion of capitalism. We end with tulips. I always think it's kind of very poetic that one of the first great sort of crises in capitalism, one of the first great lessons about how capitalism works, is related to a pretty little flower that we hardly think about today, but that is exactly what happened. Next week we will take a look at the Enlightenment, and we're going to take a look at sort of this movement, this intellectual movement that gripped Europe in roughly about the same time, in the late 1600s and through most of the 1700s. And then again, it sort of relates to the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution was all about sort of the idea that human beings could better understand nature, could better understand the universe through rational thinking, through mathematics, through experimentation, to take both to gain a greater understanding of the universe and to in effect, use that understanding to manipulate nature, to gain a command over nature, to serve human interests. The Enlightenment is a similar idea. The idea, as we're going to talk about, of sort of the idea of the human mind being utilized not to understand nature, but to understand human nature, to understand who we are, to explore what drives us, who we are, and to use that knowledge, to create a better society, a society that allows us to fulfill ourselves in the most expansive way possible, to allow us to realize the best that is in human nature. So to understand human nature in order to apply it to create a better social order, so that all people can have a greater life experience. In the same way that the scientific revolution was all about gaining understanding of nature so we can better command it to create better conditions for how humans live. But that's a subject for next week. Thanks for listening, and now stay tuned. Now take a look at the last frame for the quiz based on this lecture. And I'll see you on Monday. Oh, here's the quiz, and just one note. Remember to email this to me, and when you email it to me, just so you know, you only have to put the number of the question and the letter of the answer. You do not need to write out the questions or the answers. So if you think the first one for the answer to question 1 is A, then all you have to do is put 1A, 2B, 3C, whatever you think it is. So, and just be sure to email this to me before class on Monday. Thanks.